second for this to put up. No worries. Hey, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I've talked to most of you, and most of you know I'm Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation here. I'd just like to welcome you all every Thursday and thank you for coming and attending. Especially thank you for coming on this mysteriously cold day that doesn't look like it should be as cold as it is, but it is very cold when you go outside. And so I appreciate you hardy folks that have come here to listen to this interesting talk. I'm going to turn that over to Matt. I don't want to give away the ending, but the speaker, Bernie Siler, mentioned to me, we had a little chat, he was in the movie Glory. So maybe a few questions could be asked about his brush with movie stardom there, okay? So Matt, come on over, you can take it. Again, thank you folks.
Appreciate it, sir.
All right.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Again, my name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. It's a pleasure to have you all here this evening. And as Dana said, our speaker this evening is Bernie Siler. He is a former prosecutor in Washington, D.C. He is also formerly with the Army Reserve and has a background with the 54th Massachusetts Reenacting Organization. So Bernie's written a fascinating work comparing the 19th and 20th century Washington, and that's going to be our topic for this evening. So let's give a big round of applause to our speaker this evening.
Okay, thank you, Matt and Dana. As I indicated, I'm going to talk about a book that I wrote, and let me give you a little background on the impetus I had to write the book. Okay, first of all, we're Civil War buffs, historians, etc. I had the good fortune of growing up, unbeknownst to me, when I was a child, literally on the Union battle line at the Battle of Fort Stevens. So my house is, when I read the accounts of the battle, the Union battle line came out 200 yards from the fort. So I went up to Rittenhouse Street and walked down to Sheridan Street in Northwest DC, where I live. It's about 200 yards. And as a kid, you know, we all played on the grounds of Fort Stevens, which turned out to be the focal point of the attack on Washington in 1864. But as a child, I just knew it was a battlefield. It was directly on our route home from school, so we would wrestle and fight and play army and all like that. Little did I know the significance of that battle and how it was instrumental in saving the city of Washington during the Civil War. So even though I didn't know it, it was in my blood. And I began to think, what if I had been born then in this same neighborhood? I would have witnessed those battles. In my book, in the preface, I talk about the fact that, but for the accident of birth, any of us could have been born at any time of days. The fact that we were born when and where we were, we had no control. So I kept thinking, said, well, what if I had been born 100 years before I actually was born? And what would life have been like? And particularly, what would life be like in the city of Washington? So if you combine the fact that you're a Civil War buff, you live in the capital of the Union, you're not that far from the capital of the Confederacy, so any trip you take to the South, you're going to be in close proximity to both capitals. And I just began to think how fascinating life might have been to live then. Now, of course, that's a fantasy. Life was light years more difficult and less convenient then than it is now. So in the book, I kind of talk about some of those comparisons. So what we have is a child that is about 10 years old, standing in front of a partially completed dome of the Capitol, which would have been somewhere between 1861 and 1863. And you have another child with the completed Capitol in the background 100 years later. That second child happens to be me. First child is a fictional me. from 1861. That's why the editors call this a historical fiction, because the portion of it that deals with the 20th century are real life events in my personal life as well as in national and international life, whereas some of the 19th century portions of the book, I had to use a little imagination to add some conversation, likely conversations between people during those times. But it also talks about actual world events and national events that occurred then as well. Okay, so now, these are some of the mundane things that I came across when I compare just daily life. We're not talking about the political spectrum. We're not talking about war and the Civil War per se, or things that led up to the Civil War politically, but just everyday life. And let me just add this too. When I first ventured upon writing the book, I thought, oh, I'd come across, one or two things that are similar. I was completely floored at the similarities. They were so frequent. There were so many things that some were well known historically, some things were just known in my personal life. But I came across far more similarities, parallels, if you will, than I ever thought. Okay, there's one of my early memories in the 1950s was riding the trolley with the electric cables on top, downtown DC. I imagined a kid in the 1850s riding a trolley with his or her dad and a horse-drawn trolley. Some guy in 1860 invented something called, and some of the vernacular here is that of a 8 or 9 year old. So some of the wording and some of the things in the book you see that sound juvenile is because they are through the eyes of a juvenile. A safe pin. I imagine some kid says, hey, what's this safe pin? Well, we call it now a safety pin. So 1860, the safety pin was invented. 1960, safety pins were in common usage. My mother used to fix lunch for me to go to school, and she had something called Underwood double ham. I figured, oh, okay, that's modern food and all that. Turns out it was invented in 1822. So some kid going to school in 1859 would have probably had his mom make double egg as well, double ham. Linoleum. I noticed in a lot of 19th century photographs, and they were frequently done in studios, because photography was in its infancy, and you had to be in a special place, and you had to be perfectly still. In the studios, I noticed the floors were linoleum. Well, we had a linoleum floor in our kitchen growing up. So once again, here I am in the 1950s and 60s saying, man, modern life, boy, we got linoleum floors. Well, it was invented in 1860. So there we go. So life in the 1900s was not so vastly different or improved than that of the 19th century. And then we have the sicknesses and disease. We took it for granted in the 20th century and since, because there were so many vaccines that came out. Polio was almost unheard of by the 1950s and 60s, because when we were in elementary school, they made us take the polio shots. Well, in the 1850s and 60s, polio ran rampant. People died. Smallpox. I remember getting the little scar on your shoulder. Well, that was easy, You had to do it. You might cry, oh, I don't want to get it. No, you need to get it. And we get it. But 100 years prior to that, that was not a common thing, and people died from smallpox. So some of the parallels I made are showing a contrast between life then and life now. So they were parallel in some ways, and in other ways, they were vastly different. Okay, now, family life, everyday family life. I think that image is cut off a little bit. I don't know how that happened, but that shows the original old Smithsonian castle that is still there, one of the first buildings of the Smithsonian in downtown DC on the mall. Of course, now it's expanded to several other buildings with various other subject matter in it, but the old original castle was there. And it would not be unusual for families after church or Sunday school on Sunday to go to the animal park because they had live animals out in the yard at the old Smithsonian. Fast forward, the National Zoo, and that was a typical Sunday afternoon trip in the 19th century, as well as the 20th century. More family life, and here is where there's a interesting contrast. Of course, Safeway, Giant, those were the main sources of food in our lifetimes. Very easy, go to the grocery store, you buy groceries for a little while. In the 1950s, Dad would go down to Safeway and get a week's worth of groceries, maybe 2 weeks worth of groceries, and complain bitterly that it cost him $12. Well, in the 1800s, there was no Giant, there was no Safeway, and no Harris Teeter for sure, but there was the Center Market. If you lived in DC, the Center Market was an open market, and when I was growing up, they still had a few open markets. We had something called the K Street Market, the 6th Street Market. The 6th Street Market now in Northeast DC is kind of still a market, but it's kind of a modernized market. But markets were the place where folk got their food. And you can see some of the prices there. 10 cents a pound for beef, 12 cents a pound for pork, and no offense to the University of Maryland sports teams, the terrapins cost 37 cents a pound. And that was a delicacy. Terrapin, they used to catch them along the Chesapeake Bay and bring them to market. But now, note the little footnote below the 1800s. Rub shoulders with who's who. So in those days, the Center Market was not just a place where you bought food. That's where you got all your gossip. You know, you found out Washington was a small city. You could walk all around Washington. If you're familiar with that city now, the Florida Avenue was formerly called Boundary Street because the city of Washington ended at Florida Avenue. In the mid-19th century, Washington had, the District of Columbia had 3 separate jurisdictions. There was Washington City, there was Washington County, which is all the area above Florida Avenue up to the edge of the District of Columbia. And then there was another separate city called Georgetown. And before 1846, there was yet a 4th city in the District of Columbia called Alexandria. Alexandria then became part of Virginia because Virginia retroceded part of the land that is on the other side of the Potomac, that at one point had been part of the District of Columbia. So now Alexandria, as of 1846, was part of Virginia. So the city was small, and that led to a very insular social life. So people would meet at the central market and find out what's been going on. And why Miss Sally doesn't sweep her porch on Saturday mornings like everybody else. And important matters like that. Now, this is an image of the Center Market as the way it appeared. And this is a typical scene on a morning where folk are parked out front going in to get their foodstuffs, which the farmers from Washington County, Prince George's County, probably here in Frederick and Montgomery County, would take their goods to market and make a profit. The location of the Center Market is exactly where the National Archives is right now. And the archives, as you know, will be at the corner of Constitution Avenue and 7th Street, and also the other side of it on Pennsylvania. So the Center Market was located right there. Now, the very interesting thing about the city of Washington then was that there was a huge canal that ran right down through the middle of the city in what is now Constitution Avenue. And it was little more than an open sewer. So those few Washingtonians who could afford running water and some plumbing and waste disposal, most of the sanitary pipes, such as they were, emptied right into that old canal or into open fields and swampy areas that were unoccupied parts of the city. But it served the Center Market well because the butchers, whose backs were to the canal, could simply gut the pig, gut the cow, or whatever, and then throw the offal right into the canal along with all the other waste. And they used to have visitors come. Washington was a tourist attraction then too, as it is now. And they would warn visitors that if you go downtown, there are 70 distinct stinks from the canal. You could identify each odor separately. And as you can see, the location of the National Archives would have been right there. This is Constitution Avenue, which would have been a canal. The back side of the market was here, the front side would have been on Pennsylvania Avenue. Okay, now other aspects of life then, travel, in the 1800s. Okay, now you have to understand too that obviously you have to take into account the social atmosphere of the 19th century, depending on what racial group you belong to. So I wrote this book as an African-American child, not unlike the way I grew up in modern DC as an African-American child. So some of the experiences that I came across in this book had to be tailored unique to the experience of specific ethnic groups, African-Americans specifically. So let me jump ahead, 1900s. My grandparents lived, both sets of grandparents lived in North Carolina. So in order to get there, we would drive down Route 1 or US 29 to get to areas near Greensboro. In the late 1950s, there were segregation laws until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed and passed by President Johnson. One would still encounter various segregation depending on what you were trying to do, using restrooms, stopping to get something to eat, gas, etc. But that was just about the extent of it then. On the other hand, if a kid in Washington or a family in Washington in the 1800s ventured south, and this is where I take a little liberty with the social structure of the time. I'm doing the impression of a free African-American family in Washington. And it would not have been unheard of to still have ancestors and other relatives in the South, just like I did in my actual life. However, they may still have been slaves, or they may one of them may have been freed and one of them was not. So in any event, if you went south, then you may be going to visit folk that were related to you, but were still enslaved. And if they were not enslaved, it would still be a dangerous venture. So if anytime after 1850, then you would have to take into account the Fugitive Slave Act. Now that would not necessarily have been a problem going south because the Fugitive Slave Act was primarily focused on the ability of slave owners to claim ownership of a free black person who was in the North. They pretty much didn't worry about those in the South because if you're in the South, the thought was that, well, if you're somebody's slave, you're not going to get too far. The problem is that if you were in the North, the Fugitive Slave Act enabled ostensible, I'll use the word ostensible masters to go after their property. And I say ostensible because the person may not have actually been the person's master, but the Fugitive Slave Act had terms that were so oppressive that all it took was for any white person to swear in front of a magistrate that a particular person was his slave. And if you think there's graft and corruption now, imagine this. If the judge in the Fugitive Slave Act actually found that, yes, this person does belong to you, he got $10. If he ruled that, no, you haven't sufficiently proven that this person belongs to you, so he only got $5. But either way, there was compensation for a court ruling. I won't call it corruption, but comes pretty damn close. But anyway, I digressed a little bit. But so in the 19th century, you take a trip out of the jurisdiction. I say south, but if you were going north, more so, then there was the specter of the Fugitive Slave Act, at least up until the 1860s. So then I'm going to harken back to my life coming back from the South. I remember we would come back up US 29 or Route 1 and across the 14th Street Bridge. And lo and behold, there would be the Washington Monument that you would get back in the city. Well, in the 1850s, you see the Washington Monument, and I don't know why this thing is cut off, but the image that should be here shows a 1/3 completed Washington Monument. If you know the story of how the charitable organization that first wanted to honor George Washington in the 1840s ran out of money. And ultimately, the monument was completed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers after the Civil War. And today, if you look at the monument, you can see a clear line of demarcation where the old construction stopped and the new began because whatever quarry they had gotten the stones from at the beginning of the construction was no longer available. So now that's a different color pattern. But it was at that line that you would have seen the monument at that height, about 1/3 of the way up. So,
I thought maybe we could try taking this off a slideshow and then maybe
okay.
your slides will show up. No, it looks like the slide itself is right off.
Yeah, grab the image and draw it up.
Okay. I don't know how many more of those are going to be in that situation. But
Okay.
let's go back to that one. Okay, that illustrates what I was saying about this is what one would have seen coming into the city in the 1850s. And where it's cut off is where they ran out of money. And today, you can see a change in the stone as it goes up further. It was probably completed in 1883 and dedicated by a president whose only claim to fame that I know of, that he just happened to be in office when two major world-renowned construction projects needed to be dedicated. The completion of the monument and the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And that's none other than the famous Chester A. Arthur. You might have heard of it. Okay. Okay, let's see what we have here. Okay, here we go. Now, this really gets interesting. I told you how sometimes, I kind of casually came across this. There may be a little connection there. But this one was really a little spooky. There's a piano recital going on here. And in the picture, the young students here are all female, except for the teacher and one male student. That male student, you might have heard of him. His name is John Philip Sousa. And he took lessons from a gentleman by the name of William Withers. And he lived over there on Capitol Hill near the Navy Yard. Well, 100 years later, there's another kid in Washington taking piano lessons. And he's the only boy in the picture, and the teacher's a male. So when I saw that connection, I said, I'm on to something. This parallel thing is going to take it off now. But yeah, Mr. Jones was our piano teacher, and I don't know how I happened to get among all those pretty girls. But they took me in. And John Philip Sousa went on to some level of notoriety. Okay, so William Withers also shows up again in my book and in history, because William Withers, and by the way, in researching this, and this is something you might just want to do if you're curious about life in years past, especially in cities, the city directories are great sources of information. They would be like the modern day telephone book, minus telephone numbers. And they would show people's occupations, where they live, sometimes their race. And by doing so, you come across names that you've read about in history, then you realize, well, that guy lived at the corner of L and 18th Street. And you can go to the location and see, oh, this is where that house was. And sometimes the structure is still there. You can still see it's the same building. But in the case of these people here, Mr. Withers, I found, gave his music lessons over on 6th Street, Northeast DC, which is where that market is, the 6th Street market that I was making reference to. And you can see that he lived there, his students came there to take lessons. But he got famous in another way that he probably rather would not have. He was the orchestra leader on the night of April 14th, 1865, in a place called the Ford's Theater. And he's the one that stopped the play to play Hail to the Chief when a certain gentleman came in. And unfortunately, that gentleman left in a way different than the way he came in. Sad story, as you know. But William Withers was the band leader for our American cousin. So, and of course, in my fictitious 19th century life, I was hanging out at the Ford's Theater and saw all the people coming out and bringing his body out. Okay. Other city life and culture, found this interesting. The games the kids played. I'll go to the 1900s first. We played tag, probably all did, hide and seek. There was something called a hula hoop in the 1950s. It was all the rage. I think I got one for Christmas in 1958. checkers. When you're out playing, come in before the street lights.
Yep.
And then, of course, when we got to be on some sides, we did it like that song by a group called Fort Lads. Some song that went something like, standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. So we did all that kind of stuff, right? So now, that's 1900s, right? Guess what? In the 1800s, there was a game called Prisoner's Base, which was quite hard to go see. Somehow we had to get back to the base before the person caught you. A game called Fox in the Morning. Some person was in the middle of a circle and he was a fox and he would run after people, kind of like tag. And then, and I've seen on watercolors, just random pictures of life in and around the city. There's this one scene by Curtin Allison. They did a lot of the watercolors of Civil War battles. Well, there's a picture of the Capitol with this wooden dome. And when I say picture, I mean the watercolor of the wooden dome before they put up the current iron dome that was done during Lincoln's administration. And there's a kid with a stick, and he's walking along, twirling a hoop. And this is the 1850s. Checkers, of course. And you're reading some diaries and some accounts of life in the city, and the dad or the mom say, come in before the gas lights. So it was a similar type of culture. Oh, and the DC City Council also passed a statute that said no hookahing, which meant that you couldn't be standing on the corner watching all the girls go by. Apparently that was a big problem. People were standing on the corner watching the girls go by, just like they did in the 1950s. And they do that all the problem. More city life. All right. I had the experience of seeing President Kennedy in the 1960s. I saw him from a distance. I was sitting with my dad in the upper deck at the All-Star game in 1962. That's how President Kennedy dropped the first ball. Well, in my fictional life, of course, I would see Lincoln in his carriage going up to his summer White House there on the grounds of the Southern Home, which is where he did most of his drafting of the Emancipation Proclamation. I've read some of Walt Whitman's work when he came to Washington to volunteer appropriately to help the sick and wounded. He talks about in his diary how he would see that the pattern must have been on the same schedule. Whitman was staying at a boarding house somewhere around 3rd and Pennsylvania Avenue. And for whatever reason, whenever he would come out, it would be the same time that Lincoln would be passing by, going up to the soldiers' home. And in the words of Whitman, he says, got so we speak to each other. And that was a 19th century way of saying that they become friendly. So I saw Lincoln, I saw the famous people, like Frederick Douglass. He went to Metropolitan AME Zion Church, which is still there at 18th M Street, Northwest. So I imagined that I would have on some occasion seen him. Now, but I did see in the 1960s, Alice Longworth, President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter. Of course, she was in her 80s then, and she got out of a car or limousine or something and had, I mean, if you didn't know any better, she was dressed like the 1880s. She wasn't one about changing things, apparently. Okay, of course, Washington had bad neighborhoods, then like most cities, probably pale in comparison to New York and Baltimore back then, Philadelphia. Someone argued that's the case now as well. So Anacostia, Deanwood, and most of Southwest DC was fairly poverty stricken. But in the 19th century, there was an area called Murder Bay, another area called Prater's Alley. I recently have worked near Prater's Alley, which is now just a name, and there are buildings and office buildings, but the Board of Veterans Appeals, who I now represent veterans in front of, is right on what was Prater's Alley, but that was a big slum then. And then there was something called the Island. Now, the island translates in the Southwest DC. You might remember I told you that there was a canal that constituted Constitution Avenue back then, which essentially cut off the south side of the canal from the rest of the city, which is now considered to be Southwest DC. But in addition to that canal, a couple of other waterways branched off of the canal and ultimately emptied into the Anacostia River, which they call the Eastern Branch. And then the Potomac River was on the other side. So essentially, Southwest DC was an island. And on maps then, it would be called the island. And that Chamber of Commerce poster I was telling you about, where they were saying they beware of all the odors on the canal, it also warned not to go on the island because there were rowdy gangs and gang activities, kind of like the gangs in New York on a small scale. So the 19th century was a pretty rough place in certain parts of many cities. Okay, and here's the second most comparison that I really had to stop and say, wait a minute, this is getting a little spooky. There was a team in Washington in 1859 called the Nationals. Okay? This was before professional baseball. Most cities and towns had a baseball team. Most of them were amateurs. Most of them were government workers who formed teams, kind of like we did too, and played other cities. Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, it was a gentlemanly type of game. So in the book, I'm saying that, I'm downtown and I see where the Nationals and the Olympics just played, which was another Washington team, and they were all having dinner together. It was kind of like a gentlemanly social evening. You play baseball, then you go and have dinner together. So, this team called the Nationals, in 1876, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was formed. We now call it the National League. But that's when professional baseball started. And there's a team called the Potomacs, a team called the Olympics, and one called the Nationals. And of course today, there's yet another Nationals. Prior to the Nationals, there's a team called the Senators. But that's not the best of it. When I looked at the lineup of the Nationals in 1859, and then again in the 1960s, when I was growing up, there are players whose names are the same. There was Bob Allison, I remember him with the Senators. Some guy named Allison was with the Nationals. A guy named Burroughs there, Jeff Burroughs, played for the Senators, I remember him. And then there was Don Mincher, and there was a Mincher there. But that's still not the best of them. They both struck out a lot. So, it's kind of spooky in here. Okay, so, get more parallels. Okay, now I was telling you about the bad neighborhoods, Murder Bay. I mean, the name right there tells you.
Stay away.
Stay out. Well, Murder Bay, this is how it looked in the 1860s. If you're on the porch of the Treasury Department, 15th Street in DC, Northwest, you could look out, and in the background would be that original Smithsonian building. And this was nothing but cow pastures. But this would be where the, basically the federal triangle, which is where you would have the Department of Commerce, Environmental Protection Agencies there. There's another building that would have been back here, called the Internal Revenue. Did I say infernal? Right the first time. Okay, so anyway, so this is what is there now in Murder Bay. And this picture here, the monument, would have been just out of the picture. That's Commerce, and I think that's the Infernal Revenue. So that's a comparison of how Murder Bay has changed. On the night of the assassination of Lincoln, as part of the investigation, they found a young lady who had tried to commit suicide. I'm not going to say that the people over there were not wholesome, but there were 411 houses of ill repute in this one neighborhood here. And they found one young lady who had tried to kill herself because she found out that one of her favorite clients had done something awful. A guy named John Wilkes Booth, you might have heard of him. So this was a notorious neighborhood. They told soldiers not to go down there, even though it was a soldier that gave the name to the women. General Joseph Hooker, Hooker's division. And they used to always go over there, and they say, "No, you don't need to stop going over there." So it was notorious over there, dangerous, etc. Okay. How we doing on time, Matt?
You're about 7:45, sir.
Okay. All right, good.
Doing all right.
Doing okay, all right. Okay, here we go. National and world events. You notice I have the 1800s on the left and the 1900s on the right, but every time I start talking, I always start with the 1900s. I don't know why, but it seems appropriate. What kind of threats were there? You're living in Washington. And in 1961, there was a threat to the city. The Washington Post front page showed this map of Cuba. It had all these concentric circles with mileage in between. And the circles typically ended on some American city, Washington being one. And of course, we're referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was these missiles that were aimed at the United States. Well, just 100 years before, there were some cannons on the other side of the Potomac aimed at Washington. So I thought that was a clear parallel. Fiascos, April of 1961, Bay of Pigs, probably Kennedy's worst moment as president. Well, 100 years before, there was another fiasco. You know, the whippersnapper Confederates out there will show them. General McDowell, you know, led a contingency across the Potomac and out to a little railroad crossroads called Manassas, and they were going to teach the rebels a lesson. Well, people thought it was going to be good sport, so they packed up picnic baskets, and the ladies and gentlemen and members of Congress rolled out on a hot Sunday afternoon, July 21st, to see this equipment that our American soldiers are going to put on these upstart rebels. Well, somewhere along the line, the bridge that they were all crossing, a shell hit the bridge. and then panic ensued. And they all came running back to Washington. And they better have been glad it wasn't rush hour. They never would have got down to the 66. They got back to Washington, and the next morning, stragglers, soldiers, civilians, and everybody was exhausted, having been chased out of there. So we had two fiascos 100 years apart. And then, of course, the neighborhood that I grew up in, of course, that was the threat in the summer of 1864 with the Confederates, just a few miles from the capital. And of course, this city and surrounding area were instrumental in that whole thing because of the rebel ransom note for Frederick, Hagerstown. And as I just learned from Robert, Middletown had the same thing. They only had to give up $1,500, right?
Something like that.
Something like that, okay. Well, Frederick ended up giving up $200,000 as a ransom, got paid back in 1951. The city borrowed it from the bank. Hagerstown would have had the same amount of money. The problem was, those daggone rebel soldiers, they didn't pay attention in math class because somebody forgot to put the decimal point in the right place, and they ended up with only $20,000. And General Earl said, I thought I told you $200,000. Anyway, so Hagerstown had to pay $20,000. That all led to the fight at Monocacy, which delayed the rebel army a whole day, a costly day. But that night, the night of July 11th, and if I were there then, where I live now, I would have been able to look out and see this dust. Because you could tell during the Civil War when an army was marching in the summertime. Because the roads were dusty, and you see this big cloud of dust, you know the army's coming. So the neighbors in my current neighborhood, which is called Brightwood, and then it was called Brightwood as well, would have seen this cloud of dust coming down Georgia Avenue. Then a big fight about a block from my house. The neighborhood I live in would have been overrun with pickets and soldiers. Walter Reed Hospital, which is now moved out to Bethesda, but it used to be in Northwest DC. There is still a monument where a tulip tree once stood that the rebels were using as a sniper's nest. And as I was telling Robert and Matt, hey, when I talk about this in my neighborhood, I just have such a hard time imagining how this sniper's nest was on what is now Aspen Street. I live on Sheridan Street, and take the alphabetical S, T, W, U, V, and then it comes into Flower Street, that's the pattern that you see, Aspen Street. That's about 6 blocks, and they're houses. There's Domino's Pizza, there's Exxon gas station, but then whoever was in that sniper's nest had a clear shot to Fort Stevens. And I have part of my inspiration for doing this is just kind of like closing my eyes and picturing my neighborhood as an open, rural field. So that was yet another threat to the city. Ultimately, they retreated. Ultimately, the missiles were removed from Cuba. And then after that, there was a race for air power. Not exactly after that, because during the Civil War, there was actually the first time there was an air to land communication. A integrator by the name of Thaddeus Lowe came up with a balloon that he used to be able to launch high above the city and observe Confederate positions across the Potomac. there was a cable connected from that balloon to the east room of the White House. And he actually was able to send messages from the air to President Lincoln with respect to troop movement across the Potomac. Well, he launched that balloon on what is now the mall. Then it would have been on the south side of the canal. Ironically, where he launched this first air-to-land communication balloon is at the site of the Air and Space Museum. Completely coincidental. Then, of course, I compare, and Matt and I were talking about this earlier, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1864, July 1st. Not quite exactly 100 years, but Lincoln signed the D.C. Emancipation Act in April of 1862. That would have been the equivalent, seeing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passing Congress and being signed by President Johnson, would have been the exact same experience this fictional kid would have had when news got out that President Lincoln had signed a bill freeing all slaves in the District of Columbia. Yet another parallel. I think I talked about seeing Lincoln and seeing Kennedy. Quickly, there's a submarine called the Hundley and the David, which Confederate innovators and engineers had tried to use in warfare. The David and the Hundley were both unsuccessful. The Hundley sank and sailors died. Almost 100 years later, 1963, a submarine called the Thresher did the same thing in the Atlantic, similar to that other vessel that sunk a couple of years ago. But two submarines, 100 years apart. President Eisenhower and Queen Elizabeth were able to talk through long distance cable across the Atlantic. A little over 100 years prior to that, President Buchanan and Queen Victoria were able to send messages because they had dropped the Atlantic cable across. Yet another parallel. Blind Tom was a slave who was extremely talented. His master made a lot of money off of him. He performed in front of President Buchanan in June of 1860. He was blind, but he was extremely talented. Well, my 20th century answer to him was Stevie Wonder. Almost the same kind of talent, same handicap. A couple of other things, the trial, skip to the bottom there. The building that I worked in as a prosecutor, the first building I worked in was the site of two infamous trials. One was that of Dan Sickles, who murdered Martin Key, who was the son of Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key's buried here. His son, Barton Key, was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and there was this salacious affair that he had with Sickles' wife, and Sickles ended up shooting him dead right there in Lafayette Square. And it was the first time that temporary insanity as a defense was used and successful. And it was tried in the D.C. Superior Court, the same court that tried John Surratt 2 years after the assassination, after they finally caught up with him. After his mother was hanged, and I don't mean to be morbid, his mother was hanged, and he got off on 2 hung juries. Let me see. Okay, on the left is the 19th century view of the D.C. Superior Court, where those trials took place. That's how it looks now, and how it looked when I worked there. That's Dr. Lowe's view when Dr. Lowe went up in the balloon, was able to look across the Long Bridge, which is now what we call the 14th Street Bridge at that location. And you can see Confederate troop movement over there. And he sent the message back to President Lincoln. And this is where he launched it from. And of course, there's the Air and Space Museum right there. Okay. Kind of talked about life as an African American. There were 9 black churches in DC, 45 white churches in DC in the 1800s. The DC population was a total of 41,000 in 1860. 6,521 black folk lived there, of which 4,700 were free. So most of the blacks in DC, and so the kid down the picnic was a free black. The slaves were really in the minority in DC. So when the DC Emancipation Act took place, it literally only freed about 3,000 people out of 1,100. This is 1860. By 1862, there were more like 11,000 black folk in DC, many of whom came in anticipation of emancipation. The jobs that black folk had in the 1800s were porters, caterers, washerwomen, and barbers. How do I know this? The city directors. And they would give the people's names, and frequently they would have in parentheses, COL dot parentheses, which meant color. So you could tell which folk were black. And of course, by the time I came along, in the mid-1950s, Washington had a peak population of about 800,000. So that's gone down, of course. And 50% black, government, caterers, and similar occupations. Okay, this is the last one, I believe. Yeah, it's the last one. Okay, Fort Stevens is where the culmination of the battle took place. If you were on the parapet of Fort Stevens today, number one, you can see my house right about here. If you see the 2 smokestacks, that's on the ground of what used to be Walter Reed Hospital, which is near where that sniper's nest was, the tulip tree that the Confederates were using to be able to fire from where I'm standing, which is on the parapet of Fort Stevens. If you were on the parapet at Fort Stevens in 1864, when the Confederates attacked, you would have been seeing what is now Georgia Avenue, called the 7th Street Road, and they burned out a building from the battle. Some of the Union soldiers burned down people's barns and other structures to keep the Confederates from being able to use them as snipers' nests. So this is the view from the 1800s, and that's the view. Actually, this is even more recent than the 1900s. That's probably in the last few years. Okay, so that is pretty much my presentation. That is what the book will talk about in more detail, of course, with some illustrations as well. So if it's appropriate now, take questions. Right? Yeah.
Something, I told you, I lived in DC from 1971 to 2001. And when I came there, coming from Ohio, the one thing that struck me was how Washington DC was still fighting for self-governance. And I think about going back in the 19th and 20th century, and still, it seems like that's going to continue in fight.
That's interesting, because in the mid-19th century, there was a mayoral system of government. And one of the most recent mayors from that era was a guy named Alexander Shepard, who did a lot for public works, but in the process bankrupted the city. And for that reason, there was no mayoral system of government again until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, there was a push for home rule where the laws of DC were not exclusively authorized by Congress. There's some pushback now to maybe go back to that. But yeah, the home rule has always been kind of a lightning rod in DC, so you're correct. Yes.
I have more of a kind of question and a story. So,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought at all about including some of the public works, like the waterworks projects. I had a friend of mine tell me a story about that he was running the water system in the district, and he said he had a major main break. He had to go out and check on it. And it was over on the El Parlia side, over on the eastern side, the western side of the river city. And he said that when they dug up the pipe, it was a really large pipe, and it said MEIGS on it. It was stamped on the side of the pipe. Colonel Montgomery Meigs from 1867.
Yes.
And he said they were trying to find a coupling to fix the pipe, and Boston was the only place that they had one because there was no system that was that old.
Wow. Well, yeah, I didn't get a chance to put this on the slide, but if you look at the book, I have a picture of Montgomery Meigs aqueduct, which brought water from the Potomac across through Georgetown. And if you go down Rock Creek Parkway now, for whatever reason, they left some of the concrete from the bridge on it. You can still see the pipe above your head. So Montgomery Meigs was the one that came up with a lot of the public works. Alexander Shepard improved them, but as I said, he did so at a great cost. But yeah, so Meigs, that's fascinating. That it would
Yeah,
have his name on there.
so the water treatment plant and the pumping stations, we got an opportunity to go out to some of the larger pumping stations they use for pumping water.
Right.
And they're so ornate. It looks like the Smithsonian. They have all kinds of carvings and deck.
Right.
It's like a museum in there. We're like,
Right.
we're pumping water.
Interesting.
The stairways are like,
Victoria?
Victoria, he's got a ton of money.
Yeah.
It's quite impressive.
You did a number. But yeah, but in the book, I talk about how, when I get into what it was like for just everyday sanitation and sewage disposal, and how most people only had outhouses and chamber pots. And the richer folk were the ones that first started getting Potomac water. And some of the city directories actually show advertisements. Some guy was a plumber down on near the courthouse, and he said, "Come with me, I can pump good Potomac water in your house." But only wealthy people, the Capitol building had flush toilets as early as the 1850s, but only the wealthy pretty much. And I talk about that, so that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Bernie, we met a couple of years ago at Fort Stevens Day. That's how we touched base.
Right.
Would you mind telling the Frederick Roundtable here a little bit about your work as a volunteer and what you've done for Fort Stevens Day and some of the commemorations out there in the past?
Yeah, good, man. We celebrate every year roughly around the anniversary of the battle, which is 11-12 July. And there are two things that we celebrate. Number one is the fact that the Confederates returned back and how President Lincoln came to observe the battle and all that. But the other side of the story, and we have people who do living history portrayals, is a free black woman by the name of Elizabeth Thomas, whose land was confiscated by the government to build Fort Stevens. And she wasn't the only one, because that neighborhood was farmland. And there were several farms out there. I think there were 5 black families and something like 11 white families. But a lot of their land was confiscated to build fortifications around the city. But Elizabeth Thomas, what we talked about on those dates, in fact, they changed the name the city gave the block where Fort Stevens, it used to be called Quackenbach Street, it's now called Elizabeth Thomas Way. So we commemorate her sacrifice, and there's some legend involved with that, and there's some truth with it. We do know that she did lose her house to eminent domain, and there is a magazine that is where rounds were stored, which apparently was her cellar at the time. So we honor her, and the story goes that she was sitting on her porch crying, and a tall, lanky figure came up to her, right at her, a guy named Lincoln, and he says, you know, I know it is hard, however, you know, you will be rewarded later. And yeah, so we talk about that, we talk about the battle. And being an African-American reenactment group, we have recently learned, one of our colleagues, Brian Cheeseburg, turned up some information that showed that while none of the Union garrison in the fort itself were members of the United States Colored Troops or Black troops, however, there was a contingency from Camp Casey over in Virginia who actually did march up to the fortifications. So we depict that group, we talk about Miss Thomas, and of course we talk about the general outcome of the battle. Then of course there are the what ifs. What if the Confederates had reached the line there and made it downtown? I'm sure Congress would have been gone, the president would have been gone. I don't think the war would have ended, but it's always fun speculating. Hey, what if they had made it to Washington? Well, what if they won at Gettysburg? You know, so that's always good conversation. Does that kind of answer?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to mention one thing about today's date, February 20th. Not a things. 1864 on this date was the Battle of Olustee, which was the second battle that the 54th Massachusetts fought down in Florida. In fact, my colleagues just reenacted that battle last weekend, where several of the black men won honors. Stephen Swales was promoted on the battlefield to lieutenant. That was February 20th. This is also, and I think I'll talk about this in the book too, the day that unfortunately Willie Lincoln died. And so I make a comparison to how the Lincolns lost a son in the White House, and of course, the Kennedys lost a child while in the White House 100 years later, but it was on this day, February 20th. Then, of course, we talk about Dr. Lowe and the balloon and air travel. Well, this is the day that John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. That was February 20th, 1862. So more talk, more parallels. So keep coming in. Yeah.
Well, again, let's give Bernie a big round of applause. All right, join us next month for March. We're going to have Betty Scheidler out to talk about death and mourning in the Civil War. So a great positive comparison.